I want you to repeat this with me. Pain does not necessarily equal damage. Hurt does not necessarily equal harm. Those things are not guaranteed, unequivocal, universal truths. Welcome back to another athletic resilience video. My name is Kyle. I'm a physical therapist and strength coach and the founder of Athletic Resilience. Thank you for coming to the channel, and I hope you enjoy the video and the content. Today, we're talking about pain and specifically how it relates to training and whether or not we can or should train through pain, around pain, or whether or not it's something that necessitates we step away. I think it is often oversimplified in the sense that the going assumption societally is that pain equals damage, hurt equals harm. But I want you to repeat this with me. Pain does not necessarily equal damage. Hurt does not necessarily equal harm. Those things are not guaranteed, unequivocal, universal truths. The reality is pain is much more nuanced. Thankfully, it is much more nuanced. Because if it was as simple as just we feel pain and therefore everything went to hell in a handbasket, it would be really hard to go out and do pretty much anything because you would always be living in this kind of like eternal fear that the second pain came on, that means that something irreparable had been done. But we've all been in that situation, especially in the barbell sports, where you're squatting and you feel a twinge in your knee, you're deadlifting and you feel something janky in your back, you're benching and you feel something in your pec, or your shoulder or your elbow, and your first thought is honestly like, fuck, did I just do something that I can't undo? Like, was that the injury? And then you sit there and you're like, do I finish the set? Do I finish the workout? Do I bail? Does this mean training is just like up and done and I've just got to pack it up and like hang up the straps and put the shoes in the closet and like game's over? Do I train through it? Do I just completely ignore it? And that's why we are going to break down pain today to try to provide not only just clarity on how it arises and how it's processed in the body, but also to try to give you a concrete, systematic way to go about evaluating and assessing pain when you do experience it so that you can categorize it and determine, does this warrant my attention and do changes need to be made? Or is this something that I can just completely ignore? And we keep on keeping on and we train right through. So we are gonna cover a little bit of pain science, go over what pain is, how it arises, how it's processed, and then give you that really solid, concrete way of hierarchically organizing the pain that you're experiencing so that you can figure out what is going on before you even have to consider making an appointment, calling up the doc, calling up the ortho, heading to a PT, because there is a ton that you can do yourself before you need that doctor's appointment, that referral, for them to just confirm what you probably already could have deduced yourself. My hope is that by the end of this video, you see pain in a completely different light. It is not supposed to be an automatic stop sign panic moment. It is like almost everything else in our lives where it is just information, and it is whether or not we understand what to do with that information that dictates whether or not it is beneficial or harmful to us as humans. I'm gonna say the same thing I did at the beginning of the video because that is the entire concept of this section of the video, and I want you to internalize this and repeat it again. Pain does not necessarily equal harm or damage. Let's get these foundational things out of the way. Yes, pain is absolutely real. Yes, there are sensory receptors called nociceptors that exist in our muscles, our tendons, our joints, etc., to be able to take any sort of pain-based information, whether it's touch, pressure, chemical, whatever you want it to be, and it sends that information back up to be processed by our central nervous system. But what you have to consider is all of that information is just raw data. It still needs to be processed by the central nervous system, which means the ultimate output, do we or do we not feel pain, ultimately boils down to how the nervous system processes that information. Our central nervous system has the capacity to either completely ignore that raw data, it can amplify that raw data, it can dampen that raw data, it can do whatever it wants with that information. And a lot of that comes down to the context in which it happens. Are we overly stressed that day? Are we super relaxed? Have we really underslept as of late, or are we wildly well rested? Is nutrition really poor, or is nutrition really high quality? All of those contextual factors can completely alter how the nervous system takes that raw data and outputs it, and whether or not it ultimately ends up being perceived as pain, or whether or not it's completely ignored in its entirety. I think pain and the way that it's processed is best explained and presented a lot like the smoke alarm systems that we have in our homes. When they are working properly, they can absolutely save our lives. If there's a fire and then there's smoke and the smoke alarm senses that there's smoke, it goes off and allows us the opportunity to get out of the house before our lives end up being compromised. Our pain system, the way that it is intended to work, is very similar in that if there is damage that is done, that is supposed to be processed by those nociceptors. That information is intended to be sent centrally to our brain and our spinal cord. And then our nervous system from there is able to process that information, sends that output back down, which is the pain that we experience, to help us get the hell out of whatever situation we are in, or to avoid the movement or position that we were putting ourselves in that was potentially putting us in harm's way. But we have all experienced that moment of panic at 2 o'clock in the morning when the fire alarm goes off and you start scrambling around trying to get kids, dogs, significant others, whoever out of the house, all just to find out that there's no fire and the smoke alarm tripped for no reason. That is very similar to what can happen when we experience pain in the absence of any actual damage or potential harm to us as humans. It is entirely possible for us to experience pain and discomfort purely because we have a history, a memory, emotion attached to a position, a movement, a place where something bad or harmful or hurtful did happen at one point in time. And our central nervous system remembers that. It might remember that the last time you back squatted, you hurt your back. And now suddenly when you're back squatting, your back hurts, even if no damage is being done, even if the movement is clean, even if nothing is going wrong. That's where pain can get a little more convoluted and can make it more difficult as an athlete or as a coach to interpret whether or not what's happening is actually worth you paying attention to and is potentially detrimental to your health and well-being, or whether or not it's something you can just ignore entirely. So a couple of extra examples that I think help solidify this point and kind of drive things home are going to be delayed onset muscle soreness, which we've all experienced, right? We've all had that workout. Maybe it was a front squat, back squat day. You wake up and your quads are smoked. Your knees barely want to bend. Going down the stairs is abysmally hard. Everything hurts. You're super sore. You wish you didn't do it. Does that mean that an insane amount of damage was done? No, we all know that training induces micro trauma. That is how we promote our body to adapt. So in those circumstances, is there pain? Yes, 100%. Is it worth paying attention to? No, not really. It's just DOMS. We know it's going to go away in 24, 48, 72 hours, depending upon how heavy duty the workout was. But again, like in a circumstance like that, that pain isn't really relevant. It's just fucking annoying. So that's a great example of pain that is very real, is appropriate in the sense that there was micro trauma done to the tissue, which is what we're trying to do to promote adaptation, but it's not really worth spending any time, effort, energy over or really worrying about. On the flip side, we could take a random sampling of 100 athletes off the street, shove them in an MRI, and a good portion of them would come back with indications that there are structural changes or damage that has happened to their tendons, their muscles, disc herniations, rotator cuff tears, you name it, because they used their body. But just because that structural damage is present does not mean that pain comes along for the ride. We are a lot like cars. The only way to keep a car from getting damaged is to leave it in the garage. That doesn't make the car useful. That just makes the car pretty to look at. We're no different. If we don't use our bodies, sure, we may never really put ourselves in a position where injury or damage can be done, but we're also not using our body to its fullest potential, and we're not really allowing ourselves to progress or optimize anything. So you should really expect that if you're training over the course of a lifetime, like, you're going to take some knocks. There will be damage done. That's just what happens after you hit too many potholes, right? Like, if you've driven or used your body often enough, you are just going to get jacked up at some point. Our job is just to try to mitigate that to some extent. But because that's the reality, it is really common for people to have structural damage, and here is the key, that is not in any way associated with pain. This is a foundational concept. Research has shown time and time again that the presence of damage does not guarantee pain, and the presence of pain does not guarantee damage. Again, another great moment to repeat that back to yourself. Presence of damage does not guarantee pain. Presence of pain does not guarantee damage. So our main key takeaway here is nociception, that processing of pain, and tissue health and whatnot feed the system. They're providing raw data, but that doesn't mean that pain as an experience is the guaranteed output. You always have to keep in mind that each of us processes pain differently and therefore may have higher or lower pain thresholds, and our experiences and the context in which we are training and moving and living shape our pain experience. The whole system, again, is very much like our smoke alarms. It's intended to warn us when we need to be warned, but that doesn't mean that it functions optimally all the time. So pain, yes, can and should be a warning signal sometimes. And that's what we're gonna cover in this next section, is how do we give you a concrete, systematic way of evaluating your pain, so within 1 to 5 minutes, we can sit down and by the end, kind of have a pretty solid answer as to whether or not your pain is worth you spending time thinking about what to do next, or whether or not it's something you can just walk away from, ignore, and know that it is probably just going to sweep on down the river and we can move on with our lives. Now that we've broken down kind of what pain is, we're gonna cover the way that you can start to assess and evaluate that pain. The categories here are gonna be location of pain, the quality of pain and what it feels like, how it actually behaves and presents during training, and whether or not there are associated symptoms that come along with the pain. The way that I'm going to teach you how to categorize these things is with a stoplight-based system, which means we are going to have a green, a yellow, and a red category. Anything that's gonna fall in that green category is gonna be that classic naggy, annoying, achy, I wish I wasn't experiencing this, but it isn't the end of the world kind of pain. It is, generally speaking, going to be stable in the sense that it's not really gonna change drastically. It often actually gets better as you get into a workout, where you might start off kind of in a little bit of discomfort, but as you get some heat and some blood flow and some movement through that tissue, suddenly things start to feel better, and then you may get a little bit of a nag kind of afterwards into the next day, but it's really almost in a similar category to DOMS, but maybe a smidge more annoying, a smidge more severe. This kind of pain tends to be the stuff that you can train through, train around, maybe make some mild modifications, but isn't really anything to write home about. and isn't anything that should make you deviate from the original planned course of training. Pain that falls into that yellow category tends to either be bad enough where it limits your performance, i.e. like weight has to come off the bar, or it lingers a little bit more than you would hope after training, in the sense that maybe you walk into training 2 out of 10, you leave training at like a 3 or a 4, and you wake up at like a 4 or a 5. That's not great, that's not ideal, but it's also not like end of the world, everything needs to stop. That's more of a, hey, maybe I need to consider modifying training volume. Maybe I need to consider modifying training intensity. Maybe I need to swap movement A for movement B. Maybe I need to modify range of motion on some of these exercises. It's more of a consideration category where, okay, now I need to recognize and pay attention, but it's also not the end of the world, and it's also not something that needs to keep me out of the gym. Pain that ends up in the red category tends to kind of be in one of two subcategories. Either the pain is so severe that it is actually debilitating, and the pain has been progressively worsening over time, or there are weird associated symptoms that do not seem relevant to the pain that's being experienced. We will break those associated symptoms down further because that is one of the steps in the process that I want you to go through. But I just want you to recognize that the associated symptoms side is one of the defining characteristics of pain that goes in the red category. That does not happen with the green and the yellow-based pains. So now what we are gonna do is break down pain location, pain quality, how it responds during or after training, and that category of associated symptoms. When I was still actively working as a PT in a facility, one of the number one things I would ask my athletes and my patients was, can you poke this? If the answer to that question is yes, i.e. you can get a finger on your pain and replicate it by poking a muscle, a tendon, a joint space, a bone, that is a situation where if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck. So if we can get our hands on it and physically press a spot that replicates the pain, that implicates what you are pressing on as the likely source of your pain. Those things tend to be much less severe. That's not always the case. If you strained a quad and you poke your quad and it hurts, that's kind of like the chill version. If you actually tore your quad, there would be other much more remarkable deficits where pain might actually be kind of a backseat problem and not the main thing you're coming in complaining about. So if your main gripe is that something hurts, you likely actually are in a better scenario than not. A lot of that boils down to the fact that if we're grading a tear of a muscle or a tendon, the more that is torn, the less it actually hurts because there's not really a lot left to yank on. So for example, if you tore your quad tendon and it was a 25% tear, 75% of your quad tendon is still attached, which means 75% of it is still capable of sending that nociceptive information up to get processed as pain. If you tore your quad and the tendon completely avulsed from the bone, that means pulled off the bone, you probably wouldn't feel a whole hell of a lot of anything because there's nothing left attached to anything to provide that pain as information. So it's ironic in the sense that sometimes the more severe the injury is, the less pain there ends up being, especially over the long term. That might not necessarily be the case in the short term, in the acute kind of stages of things. I can very much tell you that the times that I've torn my ACL, it's been multiple, it hurts like a motherfucker in the moment, but a couple days later, there's not really anything left to create pain and the inflammation's kind of calmed down, and suddenly you end up with just a really wobbly knee that doesn't really hurt. That's one of those examples of you're likely going to be coming into the doctor, in this case, complaining about instability as opposed to pain. So if you're sitting there on your couch and you're like, wow, this really hurts, ironically, that's probably a decent sign because that means there's still enough of something to be processing and kind of sending that information up on high to then be evaluated as being painful. Now, if you can't get your fingers on it, that starts to become a little bit more concerning and a little bit more problematic. Doesn't necessarily mean something awful is happening, but it does tend to shift kind of the source of pain from something tissue-based to something non-tissue-based. Joints can be a little bit of a different scenario in that regard, in that if you can't get your finger on your shoulder pain, but then I ask you, does it feel deep and inside? And you say yes. And then you start to explain that you've kind of heard some popping, some clicking, you've experienced some catching and things like that. That doesn't mean that it's not tissue-based. It just might not be pokeable tissue. Now, if you tell me that you've had abdominal pain or back pain that you can't get your finger on, that starts to be a little bit more of a concern. And those are the types of things that might shift your pain from a green and or a yellow automatically into that red category, because there are important structures in your abdomen, right? Like that is where all of the organs are housed. And your spine and your spinal cord are vitally important structures in the body. So if you're starting to experience back pain that's hard to explain and you can't get your fingers on it, that is a little more concerning. The only clarification that I think is really warranted in this situation is if you do have something like abdominal pain or back pain or neck pain or something of that nature that you can't get your fingers on, that next question for you should be, can I provoke this with movement and or loading? If you can go do an RDL or a hinge or a squat and that provokes your back pain, that tends to raise a little bit less suspicion, a couple, less red flags, if you will. And same thing at the neck. If you can't provoke it by poking it, but you say, oh, looking up at the sky feels awful and looking down at the floor feels great, or vice versa, that means that your pain is provoked by movement and or load. Things that fall into that category where you can piss them off by putting them in positions or moving or loading tend to, again, implicate more of a structural tissue-based issue and not necessarily something like insidious and super concerning. Next up is going to be the quality of the pain. What does it feel like? How are we experiencing it? This kind of gets subdivided into like one of two, maybe three categories. Either the pain is that classic dull, achy, sore, annoying, obnoxious, like, yeah, I really wish I wasn't feeling this, but it isn't the end of the world. Or it's in the sharp, stabby, lightning, jolty, numb, tingle category. That's your divide, right? Your greens and or your yellows tend to be your achy, annoying, obnoxious types of pain. Your high-end yellows and or red category is going to be that sharp, jolting, lightning, and numbness and tingling is a big one. If I was in clinic and I was working with an athlete, what I'm thinking about and looking at from a pain quality perspective is, do I think that this is a tissue-based pain presentation, or do I think this is a neurologic pain presentation? Pain that comes from tissue tends to be more achy, annoying, dull. It's kind of throbby, like I just want this to go away, but again, it's not earth-shattering. It's not really like the end of the world. Once we start to get into that sharp, stabby, that could be something that's tissue-based, but if it is tissue-based, that tends to mean that it's a little bit more severe, and or those tend to be things that are descriptive of more joint-based pathology or injury. So like your sharp, stabby pain tends to come up a lot more when people are talking about meniscal tears, labral tears, chondral defects, so like the stuff that covers your bone. Those types of things can present a little bit more as your sharp, stabby and a little bit less like that achy. But if I ever hear numb, tingle, lightning, or like fire, those are descriptive terms that are almost exclusively isolated to neurologic pain, which means those types of things typically only present themselves when something is happening to the nerves themselves, not the tissue that those nerves are going down and innervating and providing sensory to. Which means if you start to experience, or the way that you are describing your pain is numb, tingle, lightning, fire, that is an automatic shift to like upper end yellow, if not red category, and probably in and of itself warrants you going and getting something done, whether it's imaging, a workup, having just a basic evaluation from an orthopedic or a PT. That type of stuff tends to kind of put you in that upper category where we'd rather not screw around with it and would rather get a little more clarity on the situation. Behavior in response to training is going to be that next focal point and way of categorizing the pain that we're feeling. If you can show up at the gym in pain and through some sort of warm-up, whether that's hopping on the bike, walking on the treadmill, running through some squats, just bare bar, going through like a set of walking lunges, or doing some sort of dynamic warm-up like you might do before like a more field or court-based sport, and that makes you feel better and your pain decreases or goes away, that is indicative of a much more low-key tissue-based problem. I would go as far as even saying if that is how things are presenting, it is likely that there isn't necessarily even any damage. It's much more likely that if you look at your training over the last couple of weeks, you probably would recognize that there's been a spike in volume relative to what you had been doing prior, and that's likely why things are starting to feel beat up. That's a very easy, quick fix and modification. So pain that gets better after you warm up, start moving as you start to get in your lift, that is very much squarely in the green category. However, if your pain progressively worsens and ramps as you move, as you go through your workout, as you load more intensely, that is not a great sign. Again, not the end of the world, but that's not what we're looking for. That's signaling that there is likely some sort of tissue and/or structure that is not just being overloaded, but is also not really tolerant of the loading you are trying to perform at that point in time. That is very much a situation where there needs to be some sort of thoughtful and intentional modification to what you're doing from a training perspective at that point in time. Now, if your pain gets so bad it physically makes you shut down a lift, now we're kind of squarely in the like top end yellow, potentially moving into a red scenario. And if it's bad enough that you physically don't even go to the gym because things at home are hard, that's much more squarely in that top end yellow moving into red category, where now we're experiencing pain and kind of have a presentation that does warrant an evaluation, a workup, something of that nature to try to tease out what we think might be going on, because it likely isn't just in the I pissed something off category. Okay, this is the most important category because anything that falls underneath this subheading is an automatic red. No questions asked. If you are experiencing things that fall into this category, this warrants going to see somebody and getting an evaluation done. That does not mean that something awful is happening. It's just that these things are often associated with slightly more severe issues and therefore warrant that kind of gravity in getting things looked at. We've already covered the numbness and the tingling, but if you are also experiencing other odd symptoms like sudden weight loss, pain that only comes on at night and while you're sleeping, odd swelling that doesn't seem to be related to anything else, and/or the location just doesn't make sense and you have nothing to really tie what you're feeling back to, i.e. like you've got pain and you have no idea where it came from, these things squarely put you in that red, this warrants a further evaluation kind of category. Now we're going to talk contextual factors that shape our pain experience. Main considerations here are going to be sleep, recovery strategies, stress, your lived experience and/or injury history, and what you are currently doing from a training perspective. Most of these actually blend together in the sense that your sleep and what you are doing for recovery and your overall stress are going to impact how you approach and go into training, because all of those things can affect how you are recovering on the whole from a nervous system and systemic perspective. Which means if you are sleeping poorly, your stress is high, your diet is poor, and you are trying to do too much from a recovery perspective, which is wildly common. That puts you in a position where you end up being systemically fried, and that progressively lowers and lowers and lowers your threshold to experiencing pain and discomfort because your nervous system is already taxed. This can end up presenting similarly to what I explained with the smoke alarm analogy. When you put yourself in a position where you are already fried, it is much easier for your smoke alarm system to be unnecessarily triggered when there is no fire. If we are completely fried from a nervous system perspective, expecting it to then process pain and our lived experience and what we are doing from a training perspective well and correctly is just not a valid expectation. Our nervous system is already maxed out in those scenarios, which means the bandwidth it has available and its ability to do the other jobs it's expected of well and with accuracy drops, which means we can end up with a nervous system that is heightened and a threshold that is lowered. So now movements, exercises, things that we're doing from a training perspective might actually net or yield discomfort or pain when they really shouldn't, and sometimes in the absence of actual damage or injury. And unfortunately, this isn't as easy as just having one good night of sleep. Depending upon how far down the rabbit hole you actually went, this could take a while to pull yourself back up out of the hole that you dug to resensitize your nervous system to a point where it's not perceiving everything that you're doing from a training perspective as potentially detrimental to you as a human. This is why if we cloned one person into two athletes and one of them slept incredibly well, ate well, stress was low, and they were really happy, might handle incredibly high training volumes and intensities, while their counterpart clone, when put in a situation of low sleep, low recovery, high stress, might be able to handle negligible amounts of training without there being repercussions. And the biggest contextual factor here is your prior injury history and your lived experience. Your brain and your central nervous system hold on to things that have happened in the past, which means if you have had injuries, regardless of how traumatic they have been, your brain and nervous system can associate those injuries and the pain that you experienced with them with specific movements, positions, environments, etc. There is an emotional context here that can drive the pain in the nervous system to automatically perceive movements, positions, even gyms and environments like a gym as being dangerous to you, and automatically predisposes you to experiencing pain for no other reason than your brain assumes you should when you do that specific movement or put yourself in that specific position or end up in that specific environment. This means that if you got hurt back squatting at one point in time, or you got hurt deadlifting at one point in time, you could end up in the future, if your personal perception of those movements is that they are bad for you or potentially injurious, your brain and your nervous system can hold on to those feelings and those emotions in that real lived experience and automatically hand you back that pain whenever you try to reintroduce those movements. This can be what completely deteriorates someone's entire training future and progress if they don't make a concerted, intentional effort to progressively reintroduce movements that step them back up to the movement that bothered them. We're gonna talk in the next video that comes out some of the more practical applications of what it might look like to progressively reintroduce movement and loading following an injury. But just for the sake of an example here, this would be a great situation where maybe you start with air squats to a kettlebell or a dumbbell goblet squat, to then going to a front squat, to then moving to a back squat, so that you progressively reintroduce load and overall movement complexity to get you back to the thing you want to do by kind of holding your body's hand and your nervous system's hand along the way, so that by the time you start to back squat again, suddenly it isn't as scary, and your nervous system's assumption isn't back squat equals bad, back squat equals pain, but oh, maybe I was just a little unprepared that last time, but that doesn't make it not a good thing for me to do in the future. The last discussion point here is overall training load and or volume. For tissue-based injuries, we're talking muscles, tendons, bones, things of that nature. The ironic paradox here is that often avoidance or removal of loading actually perpetuates and drags the issue and the pain out. Our tissues are built to have load applied, which means they respond and adapt to loading. It's just a matter of you getting the volume and the intensity of that loading correct to help a muscle or tendon or bone or thing of that nature rehab itself if damage actually was done. So again, just to like sum all of these contextual factors up, it's really common for athletes and coaches to try to make direct connections where they go, movement or whatever A caused pain or discomfort B, and a lot of times it's not that simple. And they're often really shocked if we have a conversation when I bring up and say, hey, it could just be that this training block placed in the current context of your life where your stress is high, maybe you're traveling a lot for work, nutrition has kind of gone off the rails a little bit, for whatever reason you haven't been sleeping as well, and suddenly this training block just isn't hitting right and you feel beat to shit. That can happen. That's life. That is what it is like to be an athlete. That doesn't mean that it's not navigable. That doesn't mean that it's not something that you can get around or work through. It just means you can't always make that assumption that pain equals damage, that hurt equals harm. It's just not that simple. So why does all this matter? Why did I make this video? It's because athletes and coaches tend to fall in one of two camps. They either over or under react. The overreactive camp is we bail and jump off the ship and swim back to port the second that pain happens. The underreactive camp are the ones that would sail the ship straight into the hurricane because they kind of take the fuck it, we can get through anything approach. Neither of those is really the right way to look at it, and there always is going to be some nuance to how this situation needs to be handled. But that's why I gave you a concrete, systematic way to assess and evaluate your current circumstances, your current pain, and try to figure out what category am I placing this pain and discomfort in, and then what am I going to do about it from there. Our green pain is the train through it, mild modification category. Our yellow pain is gonna be the pump the brakes category, where more substantial training modifications need to be made. And that red category is to pick the phone up, get an appointment with an orthopedic, get a PT evaluation done, maybe even get some imaging done if you get referred for it, to try to really dial in what is causing and is the source of this discomfort that you're feeling. Understanding this pain science and understanding where pain comes from and understanding how to contextualize and evaluate these situations allows you to approach your pain with confidence and not with fear. It allows you to make good, concrete decisions that are not fear-driven, but just data and fact-driven. Instead of feeling like you automatically have to go to someone else for an explanation or a solution, my hope is that this video shows you that there's a very specific category where going to that person is warranted, but that you can handle a lot of this autonomously. A lot of this is very much doable, and you are very much capable of evaluating of your own accord. And I think that's the information that just has not been presented at this point in time to the athletic population. I think this information has been guarded by healthcare providers and practitioners, not because it's complicated, but because they're trying to safeguard their job in the sense that if you know this, you don't necessarily need them as often. My argument, my contention, and why I think this knowledge is valuable and warranted and worth sharing is because this helps streamline the process and might save you A visit to a clinic might save you a visit to an orthopedic. It might save you an x-ray, an MRI, a CAT scan, when it wasn't necessarily needed or warranted. There's a lot of waste in the healthcare system, and I think empowerment and knowledge kind of from the ground up, from the consumer on up, helps limit some of that waste and some of those unnecessary visits, and hands you back a little bit of that power and a little bit of that confidence. So in the next video, we're going to take this same concept of pain, but come at it from the practical application perspective. So we're not going to necessarily talk as much about what pain is, but what do I do when I am in pain? How do I train through this? How do I train around this? What types of training modifications can I make? What modifications can I make to how I am recovering? That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where we take this more theoretical foundational knowledge and I show you exactly what to do with it as an athlete or coach. So if you found this interesting, please stay tuned because that is the video that helps you put all of the pieces together. So if you haven't already, please give the video a like, get down into those comments, subscribe to the channel, and be on the lookout for more content dropping in the coming weeks.